The agenda this week tracked allegations of irregularities in the PC Party's nomination process, benchmarked Ontario's economic strengths and weaknesses, and learned how a diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's enmeshes an entire family. The agenda's week in review begins with the stiff winds facing the federal Liberals' proposed small business tax reform. How do you explain the significant rise in incorporation over the past several years?
Well, that's right. And particularly for small businesses, there's a lot more money going through small businesses. And so I think one of the concerns, of course, is that the small business accounting structure is actually being used by professionals that are not really running small businesses. They're just using it as a means to income split, for instance, or create their own personal retirement systems that bypass all the rules that everybody else lives by in the RRSP and TFSA system. And so I think the real concern for the federal government is that these are not new small businesses that are providing goods and services via small businesses. They're professionals using the small business structure to reduce their tax bill.
Tammy Sherrill, for people who are watching this who don't have a small business, why would they care about the difference in the income tax rate?
Well, I think the key thing here is that we're trying to achieve some really important fundamental principles with our tax system. At the end of the day, one thing that we want to achieve is what we call neutrality. And here we want to make sure that businesses are making decisions because they're good business decisions. Where markets work well, we want to leave them alone. We don't want people to structure their businesses for tax purposes. And I think the thing here is that we see people making decisions about how to incorporate or not for those tax purposes. Anytime we distort business decisions this way, it's inefficient and it's bad for growth.
Well, once again, let's do a little more background here just to help people get up to scratch on this, because one tax avoidance scheme that the Liberals want to restrict is something called income sprinkling or income splitting. And again, bring this up if you would, Sheldon. This is a practice in which a business owner in a high income tax rate can reduce the total amount of tax paid by his or her family by quote-unquote sprinkling income to family members in lower tax brackets. And the impact of all of that, of clamping down on all of that, would be the changes would have an impact on 50,000 Canadian families who are using this strategy, and the federal government estimates it'll mean recouping $250 million annually in tax revenue. And again, Karen, let's go to you on this and a little background first. Why do so many people tax sprinkle or tax income split to begin with?
Well, people do it because the system that's in place incentivizes that and provides a means for that. Income splitting is something that's been part of our system for going back decades. One of the purposes of the tax system that we have right now is to incentivize entrepreneurship. So the system has put in place a variety of incentives. Income splitting is one of those. From my perspective, there's no reason why a small business owner or somebody who's running their business through a corporation shouldn't take advantage of that if that is what the system is meant to accomplish.
Yes, and Dan, let's be clear about this. There's nothing illegal about it. It's not tax evasion. It is legal tax avoidance. The code allows for it. Do you think it's legit?
Absolutely. I mean, income sprinkling is one of the three measures the government's pursuing. These are important pieces of the current tax system in Canada. The reason why I think that we have to look at this a little bit differently when you're talking about an entrepreneur is there are a variety of formal and informal ways that all family members are involved in a business, and most notably is risk-taking. You know, an employee, of course, it affects an employee's family if say, the main breadwinner loses their job, no question. But in a family business setting, you're actually starting not at zero, you're starting usually in the hole because the family home is mortgaged, they perhaps put their payroll on their credit cards in a tough month. The success of the family rises and falls with the business itself. And I think it's a misunderstanding if you're suggesting that only that one person who may be leading the charge in the business is going to be able to benefit from some of the tax provisions that are set out.
I hear you, but I think the federal government is making a distinction between the example you just gave and, say, you know, an independent consultant who perhaps has a second business on the side that is in effect just a shell corporation and doesn't really make any goods or services, but is just there as a kind of a holding pit for money. What about that?
One of our main complaints is that this doesn't distinguish between those things at all. This is a broad brush that's going to affect every business at every income level, and the information coming out of the federal government sadly is completely wrong.
The Progressive Conservative Party today claims to have more than 125,000 members, which is, I mean, light years away from where they were at the end of the last election, when they might have had, what, 12,000 or something? I mean, Patrick Brown, you got to hand it to him, has grown the membership of this party in an almost unprecedented fashion. Having said that, there are some social conservatives who aren't happy with him because he's kind of gone flip and flop on the sex ed issue, excuse me. He's a little too progressive on LGBTQ issues for their liking. There are others who are upset with him because he acknowledges climate change and wants to bring in a carbon tax to fulfill federal obligations that require the province to have a position on that. The question then becomes, is he not entitled to try to put his thumb on the scale for candidates that he believes are more in line with the values that he'd like to see the PC party today have?
Well, the party constitution suggests he is indeed entitled to do that. Unlike the NDP constitution, for example, the PC constitution explicitly states that the leader has veto power over all nomination candidates, and that might reduce those votes, as Rick Dykstra has said, to essentially a recommendation. So in that sense, the leader does indeed officially have power to choose who's going to be flying under the Tory banner.
Because he can refuse to sign their papers at the end of the day.
Right.
Sarah, how about that? This is there's a great debate in every party about what the leader needs and what the local constituency needs. And sometimes they're in conflict, and clearly have been this time. How do you resolve all that?
Well, you don't. I mean, there's always going to be a bit of a constant tension there. I mean, at the end of the day, it was the Ontario PC membership that voted for Patrick Brown. And so Patrick Brown is the leader, and he, I think, is entitled to be, to select the team that he wants to build to lead the province into the next election. So I've always been of the mind that, not that that local riding associations and nominations don't matter, but what the leader wants is actually in the interest of all members, including those in the local riding association. They may not like it, but in the long term, it's probably going to be good for the party in terms of getting better chances at winning.
John, how heavily should the leader be able to put his thumb on that scale to favor a candidate that he wants to see win?
It depends on where you see democracy in all of this. And our system, everybody thinks it's democratic, but the reality is we basically select the king or queen of a party, and they govern. And they govern pretty well without challenge. And you go back to the responsibility. Patrick Brown wants to be the next Premier of Ontario, which requires a cabinet. And cabinet members come from successful candidates. So any party leader has the duty to field the best possible group of candidates possible. The question becomes then, within inside of a party and its constitution, what is the mechanism that you do that, and is it clear or is it not? So, for example, when Rick made the comment that nomination meetings are a suggestion to the leader, I'm going to suggest to you that as someone who had a hand in writing the Constitution back in '89, that would be a great shock to most party members. Who think that
what
there's
they're doing
is
more than a suggestion.
little bit more than a suggestion. Yeah. But that's not clear, and the reality is that there's been a lot of negotiations at the leader level in the last few years for election changes that have made wholesale changes to our democratic process, both in funding but also in structures like this that didn't used to be there. So the leaders have been pushing their agenda, serving their interest ahead of party interests.
Let's, and again, we're going to put this graphic up here, cognizant of the fact that this is a party with 125,000 members and is a large big tent party right now, but that doesn't mean there's unanimity inside the big tent. Sheldon, if you would. Stat board number one, please. These are some groups that have broken away from the former Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario. This is, the Alliance Party of Ontario, the Trillium Party of Ontario. There's another group called I'm Out, another group called Ontario Blue, Stop the New Sex Ed Agenda Party, Take Back Our PC Party. There's more, but this gives you a flavor of the numbers of groups that are out there that have a problem with either the way nomination races are being run or with the leadership presented by Patrick Brown right now. My question for you, Chris, is how serious is any of this?
There aren't very many members of any of those fledgling groups right now, but one of the dangers becomes when riding members, folks who have been at associations for 10, 20 years, people who have been presidents for up to 8 years, as in the case of the Ottawa West Nepean riding president, when they jump ship for either another party or just become disgruntled. Because these are the folks who get out there and put signs on front lawns, who knock on doors. So on the one hand, you've broadly expanded your base by having a lot of nomination candidates, thus raising money and garnering interest in the party. On the other, there can be disaffection, which in turn leads to fallout. It could have ramifications down the line.
Over the next 9 months, we are going to hear a lot from, I'll say, the four major political parties, the Liberals, the Progressive Conservatives, the New Democrats, and the Greens, about what they intend to do to improve everybody's economic fortunes over the ensuing 4 years. I want to get, April, to you first, I want to get a better understanding of what governments are entitled to take credit for. The unemployment rate we've pointed out is low. We have an apparently balanced budget. I say apparently because, again, the Financial Accountability Officer is not completely sold on that. We have other, as you folks pointed out off the top of the program, other metrics by which we can say the economy is doing well. What are the Liberals entitled to take credit for, in your view?
Well, I think it's that's a hard question in the sense
that's why I asked.
Yeah, right. You know, I think I would argue that they haven't made huge mistakes, but I can't point to the one thing that they've done that you think, oh, that's really changed the lives of individuals. And that for sure, it's only that, not something else. I guess I tend to be a little bit more pessimistic about policy. I think that you can really screw things up in the sense that, you know, we've seen examples where governments have done things that have really changed outcomes in the long term.
One example?
So one example is the French requirement in Quebec in the 70s. And so that was a policy that, you know, didn't seem like it was going to be that big of an effect, but all of a sudden headquarters moved out of Quebec
big exodus.
Like crazy.
Yep.
And, you know, Toronto happened to benefit from that, for one thing. And so we do see cases where governments can really make big mistakes.
Okay, Jordan, to you on what governments are entitled to take credit for and not entitled to take credit for.
Well, they can't take credit for the weather and things of that kind, but like, you know, it's very hard because when things are going well, the government's going to say, well, it's because of our activities. And when things are going poorly, it's broader economic forces. It's very hard to pinpoint causality here. It's so difficult. There's so many moving parts. You've got seasonal adjustments. You've got the whole business cycle. You've got the long arc of technological change. There's all sorts of things that are happening that aren't directly a consequence of government policy. So I would say that governments probably do tend to overstate the things they can do that are positive, and perhaps even on the negative side too. I would flag two things though. I think Bill 148, which will include this $15 minimum wage we just discussed, I think that will improve people's lives in a significant way. And I also think it's tactically brilliant because the first pay increase comes in January up to $14. And then whoever is going to oppose that, if Patrick Brown and the PCs want to oppose that, that's great. But they've got to tell 25 to 30% of the labor market that they're not entitled to that next pay raise or that they may have to roll it back. You're going to make yourself quite unpopular, I think, when you're going to tell a quarter of Ontario's workforce that they should take a pay cut. So tactically, I think that is brilliant, the timing of it.
Just for the record, I think his position is they may have to wait a little longer for that pay increase, but there's certainly no intention to roll back whatever increase has already been put through.
Yeah, sorry, I meant hypothetically if someone was to run against that. The other thing now, it's more in the distant past, but what can the government take credit for? We hit a significant economic turbulence in 2007. And the governments did what they should have done back then, is they ran significant budgetary deficits to try to stabilize the job losses. You know, between 2007 and 2009, we lost about 300,000 jobs in terms of the labor market, and 250,000 can be indirectly ascribed to manufacturing. And the government tried to plug that hole at the cost of significant budgetary deficits and an increase in the debt load. I think that was actually a responsible thing to do. That was the wise economic choice to make, even though it made them unpopular in some people's view.
Right. Craig, last word to you on, I hear it almost every day in question period, our government has created 300,000 new jobs in the province of Ontario. Have they really?
Well, a lot of the job creation is part of the economic cycle. And what we're seeing is a stronger global economy that's helped support a stronger Canadian economy, which is also reflected in a stronger Ontario. You know, I think from a government policy point of view, the government has tried to help facilitate growth. But I think that there are some big looming issues out there and some vulnerabilities. From a point of view of the latest census numbers showed that the percentage of Ontarians that are at the low income level or lower, in other words, in poverty, has increased. It's gone from 12% to 14.5% between 2005 and 2015. So poverty is rising in Ontario. So I think there's an issue here that over the last 4 years, the economy's been doing better, jobs are getting created, the unemployment rate has declined, hasn't lifted all boats equally. And there's certain things the government can say they've been doing to try and alleviate those issues. But at the same time, I mean, this is still a pressing problem with underneath the surface of, in aggregate, Ontario's economy is doing well, but there's pockets of weakness.
What defines early onset Alzheimer's?
Early onset Alzheimer's disease is Alzheimer's disease with symptoms starting before the age of 65. So it sounds very arbitrary. It's just an age cutoff. We think of Alzheimer's disease as a disease of seniors, and by and large, the majority are over 65, in their 70s, 80s. However, about 6% of individuals develop symptoms before age 65, even as early as in their 30s, 40s, 50s. There's a little bit higher chance that there's a strong genetic component when you develop the disease young, but the symptoms are pretty much the same as regular Alzheimer's. A bit of forgetfulness that becomes very severe forgetfulness, problems with communication, wayfinding, the whole host of problems with day-to-day function and behaviors that we see in regular Alzheimer's.
Why did you want to participate in this?
My mom, when she was diagnosed with this disease, any opportunity that came her way, she said, I want to help people in the same situation as me. So it really wasn't a difficult choice for us to participate in the documentary. And I think it's coming at a really great time where so many people are in the same situation as us, and there's not a lot of resources, not a lot of understanding around Alzheimer's. So I think that was our reason that we decided to participate as well.
What's it like watching that?
It's emotional, it's difficult. I think we tend to be very in the present when we're caregiving, so it's to reflect back on it. It does bring back a lot of emotions, and it's difficult, but it's nice to have the memory of where we were.
Kathleen, your mom used to write code, right? She used to be an engineer before she became a stay-at-home mom. Do you ever wonder about what kind of impact the illness is having on her?
Yeah, and I think in the early stages of the disease, we really saw that, how frightening and upsetting it can be, because I think she realized that she was losing a part of herself and wasn't getting the answers as to why it was happening. So I think in the beginning, she really struggled with that as well, and I can't imagine what she was going through.
And you, Catherine?
Yeah, in a similar way, a lot of things that just defined my mom for who she was, which is, being very independent and courageous and very intelligent, like huge reader, all of these things that really defined who she was and were a big part of a lot of her relationships were being taken away, and no one understood why, especially her. And she was very nervous and dependent and anxious and just fragile, which was so unlike her. So it was scary to see, and probably the scariest of all for her. But it just, I think, takes away a lot of what makes a person, and that's what's heartbreaking about it.
And Dr. Cohen and Christopher, you've also been through that experience. What's it like to see a part of your parent disappear? Dr. Cohen?
Sadly, I lost my father to Alzheimer's, and I'm looking after my mom, who also has dementia. And even though I was fortunate that their disease started later in life, there's a tremendous loss of a very personal, important relationship when you lose a mom or a dad, and when you lose them gradually in slivers over years. It is really quite devastating. It's hard to deal with, as Kathleen and Catherine have described so well. You don't have time, actually. And even though I was older, I was in the sandwich generation looking after children myself, so maybe not still in school, but busy. And I consider myself fairly capable in caregiving, and fortunately I have resources, so I'm not struggling that way. But from a personal standpoint, it's painful. And when your mother no longer knows who you are, or doesn't have the niceties to say thank you or be appreciative, or swats at you if you do something that's not quite what she wanted. And I consider myself pretty lucky that I'm not dealing with very challenging behaviors in either of my parents. They're mostly very grateful. But you feel so sad, you know, that the person they were isn't there. And you also feel like at some point, I will really grieve, but not now. And what's that going to be like? You know, that goes on for a while. That outlives the number of years that the individual has the disease.
Because you have to be
for
present
the survivors,
doing so much, right?
That's right. You go over and over how unfair it was to your mom or dad, to yourself, to your kids in my case, whom I try and protect from caregiving. They're the age of these great people, and I protect them from the caregiving because I'm there to do it, and I don't want their lives interrupted. Kathleen and Catherine had no choice. They jumped right in and probably have learned huge life skills and gained great maturity, but what a way to do it.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, September 22nd, 2017. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety at tvo.org, that's our website, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and thanks to our nightly Twitter live stream on our Periscope page. That's periscope.tv/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.